There are few things in life that I enjoy more than exploring our world through the lens of Google Maps. North America, more than anywhere else, has always captivated me the most, with its vast and varied mountain ranges, winding rivers, bustling metropolises, abandoned ghost towns, or instantly recognisable landmarks. There are simply so many unique and unusual sights that would take a lifetime just to see from above. See, sometimes when exploring the United States in your digital grand tour, you may occasionally stumble across an arrow. In fact, if you look closely, you might just come across thousands of them. Many are in remote deserts or high up amid inaccessible mountains and hills, and all sitting in the open, mostly forgotten and forever pointing in one direction, or maybe two. When mapped out, however, these simple, lonely arrows create a beautiful web of intersecting paths across this vast country, a beautiful and mysterious series of routes that span thousands of miles. And so, while out in America on my honeymoon, I went looking for one. Well, I think this is the way up. We'll start here, work our way up, and then hopefully the arrow's up there. Okay, we've almost made it to the top. Of course, I've taken my cameras and stuff with me, so I am absolutely weighed down with gear, but we are almost there. You can actually see in the distance, there is Las Vegas. That's where we were staying last night. And so, oh my God, there it is. There it is. I don't want to stand on any rattlesnakes or something, but look, this little yellow piece of concrete, I didn't realize it was yellow, is the airway arrow. Look at this! From this windswept viewpoint, the tip of this strange stone arrow points roughly northwest, straight into the heart of Las Vegas. When this had been constructed, however, over 100 years ago, no doubt the view would have been of a much smaller and far less extravagant city. In the centre of the arrow were the remains of 4 concrete piers, still surrounded in old wood shuttering, and the remains of metal legs that help give us some indication of the larger site that was originally constructed here. And while today each arrow on its own looks little more than a small oddity on the landscape, what they represent was far larger and far more revolutionary, a huge, almost forgotten stage in the development of aircraft in America, specifically a novel and unique way to visually guide pilots in their early aeroplanes across the country as the growth of air transport and airmail began to explode in the 1920s, 30s and 40s. Consider for a second here the scale of work involved in this, the creation of thousands of these individual concrete arrows spread over some of the most inaccessible and remote regions of the United States. And what's more, the concrete arrow is just all that remains today of what was once a fairly large and autonomous beacon tower, topped with a searchlight that would revolve around to guide pilots as they flew through the night, all run off generators, all needing constant maintenance and care, and some cases even featuring landing fields where pilots at a moment's notice could land to refuel, replenish, and then take back off again. It was a vast, interconnected infrastructure and network that few probably realise ever existed. And what's more, in some of these remote, inaccessible regions of the United States, many of these now decommissioned beacon towers sit relatively untouched. So while in America recently, I tried to discover more about the fascinating story of these airways. I even followed on a vast road trip through the United States some of the old airways in an effort to try and find the remains of these beacons. I managed to track down people who have dedicated their time and effort to documenting this fascinating and unique part of America's aviation history.
I mean, it's a piece of history that almost got lost. And I just started looking and documenting what I found.
And I was lucky enough to actually find some. So this is the story of America's airway arrows and how I managed to find some for myself. Now, before we dive into the topic of the airway arrows, I want to say a quick thanks to our sponsor today, which is Holtzkern, who create the most beautiful watches and jewellery out of natural materials, including the watch on my wrist right now. So, full disclosure, I actually went to see Holzkern in person. I visited their beautiful shop in Germany before any idea of a sponsorship came up, and I really fell in love with their products, including this, the Terra, this incredible solar-powered chronograph with this amazing combination of metal and wood woven into the links and into the case. I don't baby my watches either. I have been using this for a while, and it has held up incredibly well. And they're all about the details. I really love the beautiful case that their watches arrive in. You've got this lovely cork cushion that it sits in. You have these amazing little wood-burnt certificates of authenticity. So whether it's their incredible watches or their very unique sunglasses, or for that matter, their beautiful handbags that my wife insisted on purchasing, Holzkerns make an amazing companion whether you're out hiking the hills in nature or at your own wedding. And I actually did both. I wore this, Holzkerns' beautiful Rohoto, to my own wedding. In my wedding photography, it took pride of place on my wrist, and I think I look pretty damn good. So check my link in the description below to get a full 15% off your very own Holzkern order. And thanks again, guys, for the support. Now, let's get back to the fascinating story of the Airway arrows. In the years following the Wright brothers' first demonstration of powered flight in 1903, one of the greatest drivers for the acceleration of aircraft technology was the possibility of mail being transported and delivered by air, though the brothers themselves were sceptical. Orville Wright predicted that airborne mail would not be useful to the extent that some people supposed. I do not think that it will supplant the steamship and the railroad as a mail carrier because it will be too expensive. However, Orville's scepticism did little to dissuade early pioneers. In September 1911, Earl Ovington, an early flying pioneer, would undertake the first official airmail flight in America, flying from Garden City, New York to the nearby town of Mineola, just 3 miles away, and dropping a mailbag filled with letters and postcards from his Blériot Mark IX aeroplane. In November 1916, the New York Times sponsored yet another flying pioneer, Victor Karlstrom, in a record-setting non-stop 10-hour flight from Chicago to New York City, travelling an arduous route through 4 states, skirting Lake Erie, and, as the paper proudly boasted, carrying sunrise to sunset mail, where letters posted in Chicago in the morning would be delivered to New York by the evening. To the visionaries and proponents of airmail, it was all coming together. Pilots were flying further, their aircraft faster, and carrying more cargo than ever. The potential of high-speed airmail that could move critical or time-sensitive letters and packages by air was compelling, a service that would be unburdened by America's varied and often challenging geography, and one that could deliver mail all the way from one coast of the United States to the other in a matter of 2 days or less. Cities were now vying to be some of the first to welcome potential airmail terminals and airports, and by 1918 the US Postal Service had begun planning out services between New York, Washington and Philadelphia. And so on the morning of the 15th of May 1918, a small fleet of Curtiss JN-4H aeroplanes, adapted with larger fuel tanks and hopper for carrying mail, began their first flights along the Postal Service's inaugural airmail route. Only 12 months after this launch, and despite early teething troubles, the success of this airmail service was becoming increasingly clear. While it was yet to achieve much in the way of commercial profit, it had proved to be an operational triumph. Pilots had flown over 128,000 miles along their predetermined flight paths or airways, carrying over 193,000 pounds of mail, with only 55 flights from a total of 1,263 being cancelled. This early 1919 map of American and Canadian Airways illustrates the incredible growth and spread of these early airways, all of which were almost entirely spurred by the Post Office's airmail service. The Aero Club of America, an early organisation set up to promote flight as well as mapping and planning out airways, defined one as being 80 miles wide, the width owing to the fact that an aviator flying on a clear day could see 40 miles on either side of his plane. Listed alongside each airway, some named after important figures in aviation, politicians or geography, are the hundreds of towns and cities that fell into the 80-mile wide route and thus considered on the airway. However, flying and navigating these vast routes was still an arduous and unreliable process. For pilots lashed into their unprotected cockpits and exposed to the elements, flying for longer than even a few hours was a difficult and exhausting process. These early experimental aircraft were still prone to frequent engine failures and breakages and unable to carry much in the way of heavier cargo. Furthermore, the effective lack of reliable navigational equipment on board aircraft, as well as unsuitable maps, often left pilots lost or simply having to rely purely on visual geographic identifiers, following rail lines, roads, or signs of civilization to determine their position. All of this was difficult enough during the day, but it made the next great hurdle, operating and navigating planes along such routes at night, almost impossible. Starting as early as 1919, attempts were being made to light these airways, creating beacons at regular intervals that could guide aircraft along the various routes at night. These early experiments grew from simple bonfires lit every few miles along the course of the airway into more significant infrastructure, the concept of aerial lighthouses that could guide planes along their route from beacon to beacon until they reached their destination. By July 1924, postal authorities, who had already successfully implemented the first transcontinental airmail route flying from New York to San Francisco, were now ready to light sections of this route to ensure continuous service during the day or while flying at night. The section of airway running from Chicago to Cheyenne was chosen first to be made suitable for night flying, as planes running from the east or west could arrive during the day and then bridge the gap along this part of the airway at night. This extensive 1924 article from the Baltimore Sun details the amazing advancements that had led to a coast-to-coast airmail service in little over 5 years. As the paper reported, the coast-to-coast airmail service is a challenge to the imagination of the wildest mental gymnast. 1,600 miles of lights flashing through the night, illuminating the heavens, turning blackness into day, marks the course of the mail planes. As the paper went on to detail, the most impressive piece of equipment along the route were the midnight suns, 5 50-foot tall beacon towers mounted with 500 million candle power lights located at the primary airfields of Chicago, Iowa City, Omaha, North Platte and Cheyenne. Interspersed between these primary towers were dozens of smaller beacons placed every 25 miles to mark out emergency landing fields where pilots could land to replenish fuel or make repairs, ensuring a safer transit for pilots who would be previously expected to land in whatever empty field or patch of clear ground they could locate in time. Finally, even smaller baby beacons or routing beacons were located approximately 3 miles apart for the duration of the route and fitted with sun valves that would allow them to automatically switch on or off when the sun set or rose. Now able to transport mail by air further and faster than any other country on Earth, the US Post Office's airmail service had in only a few short years become the envy of the world and in turn created infrastructure that was making commercial aviation more viable by the day. The Airmail Act of 1925 had now opened up airmail services to private companies, and as more and more companies moved into the industry, bringing in new technologies, ever busier routes, and the beginning of passenger services, greater and greater calls were now being made for both regulation and more stringent safety standards to be introduced. The Wild West of early pioneering pilots and air routes was coming to an end. In 1926, the Air Commerce Act was introduced, charging the Secretary of Commerce, now responsible for creating, issuing and enforcing traffic rules, licensing pilots, certifying aircraft, establishing more airways and operating and maintaining the ever-expanded lighted airways that were already in place. As a result of the Act, the Department of Commerce set up a new aeronautics branch, the precursor to the Federal Aviation Administration, and assumed primary responsibility for aviation oversight. It was made up of 5 branches, with the Airways Division being responsible for the maintenance and development of the airways and beacons, taking over from the Postal Service, who had set up the initial airways, beacons and infrastructure for their airmail services. Confusingly, however, the Airways Division was in reality reporting to the US Bureau of Lighthouses, since they shared many of the same equipment and responsibilities as their coastal maritime counterparts. So just 8 or so years after the US Post Office had started up their early airmail services, we now see this massive exponential growth in this early aviation industry in America, to the point where the US Department of Commerce has now inherited the responsibility for the licensing and the regulation of this aircraft industry, because now so many private enterprises and businesses were keen to get in on what the US Post Office had proved could be a viable and successful technology. And by the time the Airways Division, which remember is that bizarre subsidiary of the aeronautics branch of the US Department of Commerce, but is actually reporting to the US Bureau of Lighthouses, by the time they take over, this is where we start seeing these very distinctive beacon towers, the things that we can still find the remains of throughout the United States to this day. So I've actually tried illustrating one of the beacons here, just to give you a better idea of what one would have looked like typically at the time. So if you were to fly past one of these in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, this is probably what you would have spotted. Now, this, like I say, is the beacon, but it is only one part of a much larger system. And we can get an idea of that system by looking at this. This is called the General Airway Information. If we go over the page here, you can see here, it actually, in the introduction, tells you perfectly what you were going to find basically on an airway. Beacon lights, intermediate landing fields, and airports on the Federal Airways. Now, these beacon lights were spaced 10 to 15 miles apart from each other, the length of the airway. So for airways that were designated to be able to fly at night, you would have had a beacon every 10 to 15 miles. Think about that. Think about how long these were. We're talking hundreds of miles, thousands of miles of airways in total. And what's more than that, at intermediate landing fields, they were spaced every 30 to 50 miles apart along the airway. So the beacons would tell you were flying on the right course, and the intermediate landing fields were essentially a beacon station like this, but with a landing field next to it or attached to it in the field. This would allow a plane that was getting into trouble to land there, whether it needed to be repaired or refueled. They were not to be used for commercial operations, but they were manned at night by a staff who could guide in planes, repair them, refuel them, and then the pilot could take back off again. Now, this is something I really like as well too. It helps illustrate just how extensive these beacons and lighted airways had become just by 1931, only a few years into the Airways Division having taken over from the Post Office. You can see this is an airway map of the United States. All the airways are federal airways by that point, and the black lines represent ones that are lighted, ones that you can basically run at night. Now, the ones in white are ones that are suitable only for daytime operations, and then underneath it you can see dotted lines that indicate where lighted airways are currently being constructed. Now, this bit here tells you a little bit about what the beacons were, according to the Airway Division standard. The original standard Airways beacon is a 24-inch rotating unit of searchlight type with a 24-inch parabolic mirror and a 110-volt, 1,000-watt Airways lamp, equipped with a lamp changer and developing approximately 1 million candle power. This was a large searchlight, and it was fitted onto a motor that would revolve at a rate of around 6 revolutions per minute. So if you were flying towards this beacon, you would basically see a light flashing 6 times every minute, guiding you in. Of course, that was the difference between this and a lighthouse at sea, which is warding you off the rocks. With this, you were flying close to them and then across to the next one and across to the next one. Now, the other thing that I like about this is they mentioned that the standard airway beacon has approximately 1 million candle power, but also a lamp changer. The lamp changer is a really fascinating piece of technology. Basically, the bulb inside the searchlight could burn out or break, and if it did, it could leave the pilot in real jeopardy. So the lamp changer was a special device that would take a spare bulb, fit it into the lamp, focus it and switch it on to maintain that continuous operation. And it's amazing to think about that level of autonomy and automatic functions happening in something that was built in the 1920s. Now, as we move down the tower, this tower is 51 feet tall. That's the standard size according to the documentation. But it says here that 20, 62, 75 and 87 foot varieties are also available. Some of them, I think some of the ones that are still existing to this day are over 100 feet. Some are up to 150 feet tall, I believe. It depends entirely on the geographic requirements and the requirements of the site. Now, what is probably the most recognizable part of these beacons today, because it's usually all that remains on the beacon sites, is the amazing directional arrow at the base of the tower. So the directional arrow is quite clever. It serves two functions. It is pointing in the direction of the next beacon tower for pilots flying and needing to use that as the visual identifier, but it also forms the foundation of the beacon tower itself. And these beacons obviously are quite tall, quite heavy, and they're going to be places that are very exposed to the weather. So they needed a very strong concrete foundation anyway. And then at the very back of the arrow, you have your generating shed. Now, we mentioned how the beacon lights had their redundant lamp changing system for continuous operation. The generating sheds also had a similar setup. They had two generators. Now, if one failed, the other could turn on automatically. But if one got too hot, the other could turn on. And also, if any of them got too cold, they could also automatically turn on to keep themselves warm and stop any oils and fuels from freezing up. Now, on the topic of colour, most of these nowadays you'll see are kind of red and white. Red and white is technically white and international orange, as it was known. But originally there was a little bit of variance between the colours. Some of the sheds used to be black and white, and the arrows, as you can see mentioned in this, were a chrome yellow. Chrome yellow was a specific yellow derived from lead chromate. It was a toxic lead paint, basically. And it was the colour of those, it was that beautiful yellow saturated colour you'll often see like American school buses coloured in. Now, this stuff was highly toxic. There's actually a note in a book somewhere that the government had to compensate a farmer who had a beacon installed in his field because one of his cows licked the lead paint off one of the arrows and it killed the cow. Now, eventually this was also switched to international orange as well too. So there's a little bit of variance, but most of the beacon sites nowadays have nowhere near the original paint on them because most of it has worn off over the years just through exposure to the elements. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that to the American public, the building of these airways was as large and as significant as the building of the highways and dams and other massive infrastructure projects. These airways were helping shrink the country, and for a country that was so reliant on ever-increasing forms of faster communication, it was essential, and it was something the government was keen to promote. Now, this leads me to this amazing cartoon. This is called Uncle Sam at Your Service. It was a cartoon that was drawn and published in newspapers in the 1930s. And it was in essence like a public service announcement, but in the form of a newspaper cartoon essentially. Now, my favourite of the Uncle Sam at Your Service cartoons is this, and it's called Building a Beacon on Lonesome Knob, which is an interesting title, but this here shows you the building of an airway beacon. And they show, the mountains in the background, a caterpillar tractor towing the supplies up, the beacon itself being pulled up into place, and then the finished example with the arrow, the numbered beacon station, and then a plane flying past. It was very difficult building these if you consider the variance in geography across the contiguous United States. And the other thing is, once these were built, they all then had to be manned and maintained. And there are amazing photos. There's even a photo of a new parabolic mirror, a spare part being brought into one of the beacons on horseback or donkey back, I believe. And for a lot of these, caterpillar tractors wouldn't go there. They had to employ hand labor. They had to drag supplies up hillsides by hand or using donkeys and horseback. And even to this day, many of these places are in such unbelievably remote locations. You can only imagine the difficulty that must have presented to these engineers building it back in the 1920s, before they had reliable maps of the area, electricity or roadways getting into any of these places. And then again, once they were built, they all then had to be run and maintained throughout the year, 365 days a year, day and night. But perhaps the most amazing thing is that by the time most of these airways had been constructed, they were already starting to be replaced by new and advancing forms of navigation technology. The introduction of the first low-frequency radio range stations had, by 1928, led to a system of radio navigation beacons, and in 1929 the aeronautics branch standardised a 4-course radio range, whereby pilots could listen to audio signals to determine if they were on course or not. In September 1929, just over 10 years since the first airmail service and airways had come into operation, Army Lieutenant James H. Doolittle, using a combination of onboard altimeters, radio beacons and directional directional gyroscopes, became the first pilot to use only onboard aircraft instrument guidance to take off, fly a set course, and land. It marked a generational leap in what navigation technology could now achieve. Now, this rapid pace of technological advancement in the aircraft industry was beginning to accelerate exponentially and would quite soon render early navigation aids almost completely obsolete. Following World War II, and as commercial cargo, airmail and passenger flights exploded in growth and popularity, the visual beacon system became increasingly unnecessary. The high watermark for beacons was achieved in 1946, when 2,112 beacons served 124 numbered airways. However, by as early as 1950, many were already being mothballed, shut down, or sold as surplus. A 1956 article in the Memphis Press Scimitar discussed the passing of the old airways into history and mentioned that about all that's left of pre-World War II aids to aircraft navigation are a few old low-frequency radio ranges and the coloured number airways routes. And while some calls were made to maintain them, by the early 1970s the last of these relics were being shut down. In a 1972 article in the Sun Advocate, a reference is made to the final operational beacon. For 47 years they could be seen almost anywhere in the country, from lofty mountain peaks, across the lonely sagebrush flats of Nevada, across the Midwest prairies, or the burning desert of California and Arizona, to the cool forests of the Northwest. Beacons winked their greetings to motorists, ranchers and sheep herders, as well as pilots. The last of the species died in Whitewater Hill, just west of Palm Springs, California, on July 20th, 1972, with just a simple one-line entry in the log, decommissioned this date, as its obituary. So by the early 1970s, the visual beacon system had essentially gone extinct, but not really. See, what was now the Federal Aviation Authority had essentially given up on them in place of better technology, but they had in most cases been handed over to more local authorities, and many of them kept them running. In the case of Montana, dozens of these beacons were used and maintained all the way up until around 2017. Now, many of these masts were demolished, some were converted into TV and other radio aerials and the like. Many that were on rented fields or near towns or near airports were eventually demolished to make way for extra buildings and new developments, but many of these were locked up, closed and left behind. And even the ones that had been removed and demolished, one of the things that almost always remained behind was the concrete arrow. Of course, now more visible than ever now that the shed and the mast had been removed from over the top of it. And it got me thinking, as I was researching and investigating the history of these things, could I actually find some for myself? I was about to visit the United States for both my honeymoon and to visit the TC497. I made a video all about that. I'll leave a link to it up in the description. And I thought to myself, could we track some of these down as part of a road trip that follows these old airways? And well, we got out a map and we started planning. Starting in Yuma and after visiting the TC497, we would head north for Las Vegas, where an old airway beacon was located right in the outskirts of the city. After that, we'd continue north along the I-15 into Utah, where 3 more beacons were visible on the map, 2 out in the wilderness and 1 in the small city of St. George. The first beacon was quite an easy find, as after leaving Las Vegas we parked up next to an RV dealership and I picked my way up the rocky hill to the summit. This particular site was marked on Google Maps, and so visitors are probably not uncommon. In fact, the arrow itself had been recently repainted a bright yellow reminiscent of the original chrome yellow. Having successfully found this first beacon though, the sense of adventure ahead of us was really exciting. I imagine few, if anyone, had ever planned such a bizarre and unusual route through the United States without this old airway acting as the inspiration or guide. The second beacon on our list was remote, located on a hill running next to Interstate 15 outside of a small town called Moapa. Eventually, however, I spotted the hill, and after pulling over, I started my hike along what is known as Beacon Hill Road, a clear sign that I was on the right track. I'm fairly sure that little glowing dot underneath the lower masts is the airway arrow, so we're not even far away by now. The dirt road was pretty well established, clearly being used by those servicing the forests of aerials and masts on the top of Beacon Hill. I thought at first the arrow might be at the very summit, however, but as the track began to wind up the hill, I spotted it. This site was unusual, as the arrow was uniquely stepped down the slope, and the area that the mast would have been fitted onto at the centre was sitting at quite a slant. Back when it was constructed, this view looking north would probably have looked out on the early US Route 91, which in 1926 replaced the earlier historic Arrowhead Trail. Now the massive interstate runs through it, but the view over the hills and vast landscapes was breathtaking, and probably not far from what the original airway engineers had found back in the 1920s and 30s. Next up was another rural arrow, sitting further off the interstate. However, by the time we reached this second site, it was getting quite late, and with the light fading and facing an hour's walk just to get there, I decided to carry on to St. George, happy with the 2 arrows that I'd managed to tick off for that day. St. George is a beautiful historic Utah city, famous for its red sandstone cliffs, Dixie sign, and, radioactive contamination from the 1950s nuclear tests. However, after a night in a beautiful bed and breakfast that incidentally had a car jacuzzi in the bathroom, we headed up to a cliff overlooking the city, and after a short walk, we found our 3rd arrow of the trip. It was a beautiful, cool morning, and we sat up there for quite a while, taking in the incredible views stretching out ahead of us for miles. A small information sign tells of the history of this marker, but even better, just below is a metal plaque engraved with the words, "This marks the spot where Bonnie Day agreed to take Michael J. Milberger as her eternal companion. Her first words after he asked her to marry him, I think I'm gonna throw up." How sweet is that?
What a lovely spot for it.
It's amazing. When this marker was built and in use, St. George's population would have numbered in the 2,000 to 3,000, a small but prosperous town in the historical Dixie region of southwest Utah. Now that population numbers closer to 100,000, and the ever-growing suburbs have crept closer and closer to what was once a lonely airway beacon. If you were to arrive by plane today, you'd land at the St. George Airport, but this arrow would have originally been associated with the nearby, now disused, St. George Municipal Airport, an amazing airfield perched on top of one of the town's distinctive mesas. Leaving the beautiful St. George behind, we drove west on the next leg of our arrow hunt, but first passing through the incredible Zion National Park, skirting a freezing Bryce Canyon, and then through Monument Valley itself, one of America's most iconic landscapes. I often found myself wondering what it must have been like for these airmen, flying these vast distances, passing over these incredible landscapes, and being some of the first, if not the first people to ever witness them from the air. A few days later, we crossed the border into New Mexico and on the road to Albuquerque, where I had found a string of former beacon stations that once served the CAM 34 Los Angeles to New York Airway, and what would potentially be our last chance to see any on this trip before flying back home to Scotland. The first stop was an arrow located right next to a cliff edge on the highway. To get there, though, we had to pull off I-40, and interestingly, we soon found ourselves driving upon the original Route 66. Route 66 was established in 1926, at a time in which the highway building and lighting of the airways was in full swing. Route 66 doesn't really exist anymore as a fully continuous highway. It was officially decommissioned in 1985, being replaced by the larger interstate highways that now run alongside it in many cases. However, much like the scattered remains of the old airways, sections of it still exist, and it felt fitting to be driving along one of America's most famous transportation routes in search of the remains of a far less recognised one. Eventually we pulled onto the road that I thought might take us to the Arrow, but we quite suddenly came up against a gate. We had stumbled across a US military base, though the gatehouse looked strangely run down, and the whole place seemed oddly abandoned. I think we've gone the wrong way. Yeah, I don't think we're getting onto this base.
I mean, it looks a bit official.
Actually, what I was going to say is it weirdly doesn't. It looks abandoned. Already on a tight schedule and getting slightly creepy vibes, we decided to drive off in search of our next Arrow. But only later did I realise what we had found. Fort Wingate, an abandoned US military base closed in the 1990s. It was somewhat eerie seeing the rundown guardhouses and buildings on Google Maps. This vast complex, originally established in the 1880s and now sitting empty. The Arrow itself seems to sit next to the old bunkers or munition stores of some sort, but it was an interesting juxtaposition of an abandoned beacon site in an abandoned US military base running next to the old remains of one of America's most famous highways. Next up was Pruitt, just down the road, but once I arrived I found quite quickly that this arrow was clearly on private land. Not wanting to trespass and knowing the Americans' predisposition to shooting first, we decided once again to hop in our car and carry on. And by this point I was getting a little bit down. I had missed more arrows on our journey than I had gotten a chance to actually visit at this point, and with the day wearing on I knew I only had time to visit at most 1 or 2 more arrows. However, soon we came across the small town of Milan, perhaps not as glamorous as its Italian counterpart, but home to probably one of the most interesting beacon sites in America. However, I wasn't feeling too confident after our string of bad luck that day, and I had my fingers crossed that I'd be able to even see anything at all, and well, I wasn't disappointed. This amazing little museum hosts an incredible recreation of not just the beacon station and arrow, but also a whole range of airway artefacts that have been relocated to this site for display. I think what's quite interesting about this entire airfield is that a lot of this has been recreated, and this generator shed, it seems, isn't actually from this airfield. This is from the Bonita Canyon 10 miles south of here. So they have kind of pieced together this original transmitter tower and arrow and all these other bits and pieces from what has been left around the surviving sites. I think that's really cool. I think that's really interesting. So here's the lovely fresh pointy arrow with the center beacon point here, and you can basically see the metal supports which we've been finding around the sites we've explored, this one in far better condition. And of course this is the actual transmitter tower itself. Beautiful thing. But again, this one's been donated. This isn't actually original to this airfield. It was donated in 2011. So it's actually quite amazing how they've managed to piece together this entire museum from the surviving artifacts in the surrounding areas. I think that's really remarkable. And of course, they managed to get original pieces that weren't once here but are now here for preservation, such as the nice metal arrow that they have over there at the side. Wow, so this is really interesting. I had no idea this was at this site. This is an example of a metal arrow. Some of these were built in areas where it was basically too remote to do cement arrows. And I'd read a little bit about them, but I didn't actually know they had one here. But this isn't from this site originally. It looks like it was moved to Grants from the El Moro Intermediate Airfield. That's really interesting. So this is it here. Again, I'll watch out for snakes as the sign recommends, but here is a metal arrow. You can see at the bottom here, there's your number. What is that? 598, and then the shaft, and then there's the point up there at the end, and in the center here, that is where the antenna mast would have been. Fascinating. Route arrow 59B, so I thought it was 598. It's 59B. Donated in loving memory of our parents, Paul and Mary Tate Hammond, Milton and Norma Jones Talbert, and Albert and Vicky Hammond. What an amazing preservation of such a cool artifact. It's wonderful. And then if you look back there is your transmitting station. Amazing. The Grants Milan Municipal Airport is quite unusual, as the beacon here actually predates the airport itself. Originally, the nearest place for a plane to land was a few miles down the road, where an intermediate landing field had been set up as part of the airway sometime between 1929 and 1931. This was called the Akamita Intermediate Field, and it is still faintly visible on Google Maps today. Archive photos show the buildings and masts that would have once been at Akamita, but in the early 1950s it was relocated, buildings and all, to Milan, where the Grants Milan Municipal Airport was officially established, right next to the beacon station. The site also included a larger flight service station, used to provide essential flight information to aircraft flying the route. When I turned up to the museum, it was officially closed, but both leaflets and signage are provided so that you can explore the outdoor sections at any time. My only regret is that my visit didn't align with their opening hours, as there's a lot more to see in both the former generator shed and the main flight service station building that have been turned into museums. With our visit to the little town of Milan and its beautiful museum now over, so too was our hunt for the Arrows. On a tight schedule, we now drove east for Albuquerque and then all the way up north to Denver, where we would finally fly home from our unforgettable trip through America's West. I had done something I had always dreamed of, tracking down the remains of some of America's unique aviation history. But before I could close the book on this project, I wanted to talk to some experts in the niche world of the airway arrows and the people who first introduced me to the topic in the first place.
Hi, my name is Brian Smith.
And I'm Charlotte Smith, and I created the website, and we call it Arrows Across America.
If you have ever researched or read or looked up anything about the airway arrows, it's more than likely that you have stumbled across the hard work of Charlotte and Ryan Smith, who have for years worked to collect the locations, histories and photos of the old airways. After getting back to Scotland, I was lucky enough to sit down and chat to them about their work and how they first managed to come across the unusual area of study that is the airway arrows.
This all started because of an email that a retired coworker of Brian's sent.
I just said, oh, this is interesting. I forwarded it to her. She got it and really got into it.
And so I go, I need to find out more about this. So I went searching on Google and see if there was anything there. And within a month, I had 50 arrows. And I go, what am I going to do with these 50 arrows? No one knows about them. There's only 3 listed on the internet at this current time. So I went on. Brian was gone for the weekend. So I went on and made a website. And when he come home, I had the 50 arrows on the website. He goes, what did you do?
Arrows Across America is now a vast catalogue of arrow sites, coordinates and information associated with the history of the airways. Ryan and Charlotte have also now toured up and down the country, locating arrows and photographing them in person.
The arrows fit perfectly into our lifestyle. On vacations, we like driving vacations. And we'll spend a couple of 2, 3, 4 weeks driving around the United States in the car,
Now, what's interesting about all of this is when I started this back in 2013, I knew nothing about airways. I knew nothing about planes. I knew nothing about navigation.
That's fascinating, because I was going to ask there what your background was, because I assumed maybe you were going to say that you were in the Air Force or you'd been in the commercial air industry for, your entire career, and then this is now your hobby. So this was just something that it was really the curiosity of the arrow in the ground, not so much the connection with the aircraft.
It was really the curiosity of the arrow in the ground.
Charlotte and Ryan's dedication to keeping this piece of history alive is really quite inspiring, especially as without it, far fewer of us today would know or appreciate this vast, now mostly lost infrastructure that once covered the United States. But, you've put in so much time and you've dedicated so much now to documenting these. What do you think it is on a larger scale? What do you think is drawing other people towards this?
I think it's the history and the fact that it was never made public. I mean, it's a piece of history that almost got lost. It's very close to being lost.
So thank you very much for watching my video on the airways, featuring my incredible model making skills. I made this in like half an hour. I'm pretty impressed myself by this, but I love this topic. This is something that I love about making these kinds of videos, is that I wasn't really interested in this topic from anything other than a purely visual basis. It was that concept in my mind of all these arrows stacked up on top of each other in that animation that you might have seen at the beginning of the film. I really wanted to do that, to take the photos of all of those different arrows all across America and then kind of piece them together into that animation. And, I was then like, well, I can make like a 10-minute history of it after that. But then it kind of ballooned into this fascinating story about early airmail and the aviation industry, which was basically pioneered by, of all things, the US Post Office as they kind of started this airmail service. Now, something I didn't also mention in the video, when I was in Albuquerque, just towards the end of the trip, I actually went into an antique shop, and one of the first things I saw were these beautiful airmail envelopes from the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and some of them are actually stamped with a kind of commemorative stamp that features an airway beacon on them. I thought they were absolutely beautiful. I ended up buying a few of them, and I think that's that's the thing that really captivates me the most about all of this. It's that early development, that kind of rough beginnings of before we get into the real technologically advanced, aerial navigation and sat nav that we talk about nowadays, things that are so almost beyond my understanding. And we go back to the more analog solutions to problems where, it was literally a case of get in the plane, take off, and we have set up a light every 10, 15 miles. Just keep following it until you get to your destination and then just drop off the bag of mail in your plane. It's just, I think it's amazing. And, how these early pilots managed to do this is quite remarkable. And it sent me down so many different rabbit holes. I tried to tie it all together in this video somewhat, but there was so much I wanted to talk about. The building of some of these beacons and some of the unique and unusual locations that they were built in. I wanted to talk more about, radio navigation as well too, and maybe some of the planes that were in use. But again, how long can this video possibly be? It could go on forever and ever and ever. But I think my biggest takeaway from this, more than anything else, was that this has been one of the most rewarding and wonderful and fun and just amazing ways of exploring a place. We went out to America on my honeymoon, which obviously was fantastic. But the other reason I went out on my honeymoon was to go to see the TC-497, which I made a video about, but also was to do this road trip. And it's like, what a unique and unusual way to plan a road trip. Basically to look at this old map of, aerial airways and the beacon stations and go, right, we're going to try and find some of these. It's a little bit like, I saw a lovely video by a guy, what's his name? Noah Caldwell Gervais, maybe, on YouTube. I think that's his name. And he made a video in which, it was a very long video, and basically in which he was following the old route of Route 66 as much as possible. Because, certain parts have been demolished, and there's some parts that are there, but some are private roads now, and some are still part of the regular highways and the like. And, I think if you're going to a place, if you're going and exploring a place, it's really fun to have that hook, because it makes you feel so much more rewarded wherever you get to, because you're ticking something off the list. There's a sense of achievement that goes along with it all, So, fascinating story, really fun video that I'm so glad I managed to cover. It's been really good fun revisiting as well my time in America through all this footage and the like too. But it really kind of made me realize how much fun it is sometimes discovering a place with a mission in mind, in the case of this, finding these different beacons and airways. But that, I think, is about it. Thanks again to my patrons. As always, I will leave maybe a big master post of all of my kind of information, maybe the things I didn't get a chance to talk about in this video on there. So if you'd like to go subscribe, patreon.com/CalumRassi, I think it's called. And also, I've got this hat. You've probably seen this come up in the videos. This is not product placement. This is. You should buy a Holtzkern watch. They're absolutely fantastic. But this is not product placement. This is actually just my cap that I designed. It's my Heli-Home cap. I'm trying to make a bit of a merch store on my website. If you go to, I'll leave a link in the description below. I'm trying to make my art that I usually feature in my videos, whether it be the drawings or, well, I'm not going to sell this as merchandise, but, the stuff that I make in the videos, I want to be able to put on, t-shirts and caps and posters and the like. And if you are interested in any of that, I'll leave a link in the description below. But I think that is it. According to my watch, it's very late. And I came in here after having been out on a lovely sunny day, which is where I'm wearing my cap. And it's now like 1 a.m. So I had better get this video finished and up so that you guys can watch it. But thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.